The thing I remember most about my father's funeral isn't the casket or the flowers, or the way the rain held off just long enough for everyone to pretend the day wasn't as gray as it felt. What I remember is my uncle standing at the front of that church, delivering the most beautiful eulogy anyone there had ever heard, with my late father's office keys already tucked into his palm. I watched him fold his fingers around them while he talked about loss, while he talked about family, and some small, cold part of me, the part I'd spent years teaching to stay quiet, whispered that a man who is truly grieving does not arrive at the funeral already holding the keys. My name is Sarah, and at the time my father died I was 34, living 2 hours from the town I grew up in, the kind of woman people describe as good with details, right before they hand me the things no one else wants to do. I didn't think much of that detail then. Grief makes you generous. It makes you assume the best of everyone, because assuming the worst feels like one more weight you can't carry. So when my uncle reached the end of his eulogy, and the whole room was wiping its eyes, I told myself I'd imagined the keys, imagined the strange calm underneath his sorrow, imagined the way his voice never once cracked the way mine would have. My father, James, had been the steady one, the careful one. Robert, his younger brother, had always been the charming one, the one who lit up a room and left other people to handle the bill. I loved him the way you love family you don't examine too closely. 3 days after we buried my father, Robert came to me with his hand on my shoulder and that warm, easy smile, and he asked me for a favor. He said the family business and my father's trust had a mountain of paperwork that needed sorting, and that he didn't trust anyone with it the way he trusted me. "You've always been the meticulous one, Sarah," he said. "Your dad used to say you could find a mistake in a phone book." He told me it would be a comfort to the whole family to have someone careful watching the numbers. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that I shouldn't bother the others with any of it. "No need to stress your cousins with boring spreadsheets," he said. "Just bring anything to me." I was flattered. I was grieving. I said yes. Before I keep going, I want to step out of this memory for just a second, because if you've ever lost a parent, you already know the strange fog those first weeks live in. I'm curious where you're listening from right now, and whether it's late where you are, because these are the kinds of stories that seem to find people at night. Have you ever been handed a favor by someone you trusted, only to realize later it was never a favor at all? If you have, I'd really love for you to tell me about it in the comments, because I read them, and these stories matter to me more than you know. And if you find yourself nodding along to any of this, maybe consider following, so the next one finds you too. Okay, let me go back. The first night I sat down with my father's accounts, I felt almost peaceful. His records were exactly what I expected from him: clean, dated, every column reconciled, every receipt where it belonged. For a few hours it was like sitting with him again, hearing his voice in the neat margins and the careful handwriting. And then I reached the last several months, the months after his diagnosis, and the handwriting changed. Not his handwriting, the pattern. There were entries now that didn't match anything else in 20 years of his bookkeeping. Round numbers. Clean, even withdrawals, the kind real expenses never are, labeled simply as consulting fees, and routed to a company I had never heard of and couldn't place anywhere in my father's life. 15,000 here, 20 there. Always tidy, always vague. My father, who once spent 40 minutes reconciling a $4 discrepancy, had apparently started paying out tens of thousands of dollars to a consultant with no name, no invoice, no explanation. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself there were a dozen reasons a dying man might rearrange his affairs, that maybe Robert had set up something to help during the illness, that grief was making me suspicious of shadows. I almost closed the laptop and went to bed, but I've never been able to let an unexplained number sit. It's a flaw, or it was, until it wasn't. So instead of letting it go, I did the thing I always do without thinking. I took a screenshot. Then another. I made a quiet little folder on my computer, gave it a name no one would ever look at twice, and I dropped the images inside. I didn't know yet that I was building anything. I wasn't planning to confront anyone. I just wanted a record, the way I always keep a record, the way my father taught me. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark a long time, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the next morning, when I watched my uncle hold court at the family table like a king who'd inherited a kingdom, that quiet folder was already waiting on my screen, and something in me had started to pay attention. The first family dinner after the funeral was supposed to be quiet, just the closest of us gathered to feel a little less alone. Instead, it became a performance, and Robert was the star. He arrived with 2 bottles of expensive wine, a bakery box for my aunt, and an envelope of cash for each of my younger cousins, pressing the bills into their hands while telling them their father, my late uncle, would have wanted them looked after. When the check came, he waved everyone's wallets away before they'd even reached for them. "Family doesn't pay when I'm at the table," he said, and the whole room glowed at him. I watched it the way you watch a magician you've already half figured out, because here is what nobody else at that table seemed to notice: the money flowed outward, generous and loud, but every dollar of it traced back to one place. Robert was the one with access now. Robert held the keys to the business, the signatory power, the accounts. He wasn't giving away his own money. He was distributing the family's money and collecting the family's gratitude in return. He had made himself the source of everything, which meant that questioning him would feel, to everyone, like questioning the hand that fed them. It was generous. It was also a kind of ownership, dressed up as love. So I waited until the dinner softened, until the plates were cleared, and then I asked him quietly, almost casually, about the consulting fees I'd seen in my father's accounts. I kept my voice light. I framed it as a daughter, just trying to understand her dad's last months. And Robert laughed. He laughed warmly, fondly, the way you laugh at a child, and he reached over and patted my hand in front of everyone. "Oh, Sarah," he said, "you're just like your father. Always worrying about the small things." He told the table I'd been working too hard on the paperwork, that he was a little worried about me, that grief does strange things to careful people. He never answered the question. He answered me, the person, and made me smaller while he did it. And the room nodded along, because of course they did. He'd just bought them dinner. I felt it then, that particular helplessness of being managed instead of answered. He hadn't denied anything. He hadn't explained anything. He'd simply rewrapped my question as a symptom of my fragility, and everyone had accepted the new packaging. If I pushed, I'd be the anxious one, the obsessive one, the daughter who couldn't grieve like a normal person. I sat back, I smiled, and inside, the cold, quiet part of me took another careful note. It was my grandmother who steadied me. Margaret was 80, one and sharp as a blade, the kind of old woman who heard everything while appearing to hear nothing. As I was leaving, she caught my arm in the hallway, away from the others, and her grip was stronger than it had any right to be. "Your father," she said, lowering her voice, "loved his brother. But he never once trusted him with a dollar." She looked toward the dining room where Robert's laugh was still rolling out over the others. "James trusted Robert with a toast, never with the till. You remember that." Then she squeezed my arm and let go, and walked off as though she'd said nothing at all. I drove home with her words sitting in my chest like a stone that was somehow also a key. My father had loved his brother, but never trusted him with money. So why, in the last months of his life, would tens of thousands of dollars suddenly start flowing to a company that traced back, however faintly, to that same brother? It didn't fit. James didn't change his mind about people. He'd spent his whole life being right about them. That weekend, I went to my father's house, the one still full of his coats and his reading glasses and the smell of him, and I went looking, not for anything in particular at first, just looking, the way you do when grief and suspicion start to braid together. It was in his office that I found the drawer. The bottom, right drawer of his desk was locked, which was strange, because my father never locked anything in his own home. It took me an hour to think of the old watch box on his shelf, and inside it under the watch he never wore, a small brass key. The drawer slid open on a single thick folder, and there, in my father's careful hand, was the original trust paperwork. I read it twice, then a third time because the words refused to settle. The trust named 2 people to administer his estate after his death. One of them was Robert, and the other one, clearly, deliberately, in my father's own signature, was me. I had been named co-trustee, which meant that everything Robert had told the family, every claim that he alone was managing my father's affairs, every reason he'd given for keeping the books to himself, was a lie sitting on top of a document I now held in my hands. And if this version existed, then the version everyone else had seen was something else entirely. The only question left was how, and how much, it had been changed. I laid the 2 documents side by side on my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, my father's original trust from the locked drawer, and the copy Robert had quietly circulated to the family weeks earlier, the one he'd handed out at the funeral reception like a man distributing hymn sheets. For a long time they looked identical. Same paper stock, same headings, same dense legal language that made my eyes slide off the page. And then I found it. One page, a single page where the language had changed. In my father's original, I was named Coat Trustee, with equal authority to administer the trust and the business alongside Robert. In Robert's version, that paragraph was gone, rewritten, my name erased and replaced with language naming him sole administrator, with full discretion over every account and every asset. And at the bottom of that altered page sat my father's signature. Except it wasn't. I had grown up watching my father sign his name 1,000 times, on report cards and permission slips and birthday cards. The signature on Robert's version had the right shape and the wrong sole. The pressure was off. The loop in the J too round. It was a careful copy made by someone who had studied my father's hand, but had never lived inside it the way I had. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I photographed both pages, front and back, in good light, with the date visible on my phone. Then I started a timeline, a plain document where I wrote down everything in order: the diagnosis, the first odd withdrawal, the date of the funeral, the date Robert circulated his version. My father taught me that a feeling is worthless in a disagreement, but a date is a weapon. I was beginning to assemble dates. But two versions of a page only prove a discrepancy. They don't prove theft. To prove theft, I needed to follow the money, and now I had something I hadn't had before. I had the original trust, which meant that legally, whether Robert liked it or not, I was a co-trustee with every right to walk into my father's bank and ask questions. So that Monday I did. I put on the blazer I wear when I need people to take me seriously, and I drove to the branch where my father had banked for 30 years. I brought the original trust, his death certificate, my identification. I sat across from a banker named Michael Brooks, a careful man with tired, observant eyes, and I watched something flicker across his face when he read the document, something that told me I was not the first person in my family he'd had a complicated conversation with. He excused himself twice. When he came back the second time, he slid a thick stack of printed statements across the desk and said, almost gently, as co-trustee, you're entitled to the full account history. I'd encourage you to read it carefully. I read it carefully. I read it for 3 nights. The $600,000 didn't leave in one dramatic theft. That's what made it so easy to hide and so damning once you saw it. It left in patterns. Steady, patient increments, beginning in the weeks after my father's diagnosis and continuing right through his death and past it. Every transfer landing in the same place, that nameless consulting company. Tens of thousands of dollars a month, flowing out of a dying man's accounts and a grieving family's business into an entity none of us had ever heard of. When you laid the statements end to end, the picture wasn't a man making poor decisions. It was a faucet, opened deliberately, draining a life's work one careful turn at a time. So I researched the consulting company. It took one evening and a small fee to pull the public incorporation records, and when I did, the last thread of doubt I'd been clinging to finally snapped. The company had been registered just weeks after my father's diagnosis was confirmed, and the name listed as its sole owner, its sole officer, its everything, was Robert. My uncle had formed a company to receive my father's money, almost the moment he learned his brother was dying. This wasn't a man who'd panicked and made a mistake in the chaos of grief. This was a man who had seen an opening the size of a death sentence and built a machine to walk through it. I printed the records and added them to the file. Everything in me wanted to drive to his house that night and throw it all on his porch. I sat in my car with the engine running, the folder on the passenger seat, and I imagined his face. And then I made myself turn the engine off, because I knew Robert. If I confronted him now, with a partial picture and a hot temper, he would do what he always did: smile, soothe, reframe, and quietly move the money somewhere I'd never trace it. The originals would vanish. I would be the unstable niece who made wild accusations at a grieving family. No, I would stay quiet. I would keep collecting. I would put the originals in a safe deposit box where no charming man could reach them, and I would let him keep believing that nobody was watching. Being underestimated, I was starting to understand, was not the weakness he thought it was. It was the only real advantage I had, and I intended to use every bit of it. The trust attorney's office was nothing like I expected. No marble, no intimidation, just a quiet room full of books, and a man named William Carter who listened to me for a full 20 minutes without interrupting once. I laid it out the way I'd learned to lay everything out by then, in order, with dates. The original trust first, then Robert's altered version, then the bank statements and the incorporation records. When I finished, he didn't gasp or perform any sympathy. He simply put on his glasses, read both versions of that one critical page, took them off again, and said something that rearranged the entire ground beneath me. "Sarah," he said, "the original document appears valid and properly executed. The amended version, if your father did not sign it, is not a mistake. It's forgery, and using it to redirect assets is fraud. Both are crimes." Then he explained what I hadn't understood in all my careful collecting, that as a legally named co-trustee, I wasn't a helpless relative making accusations. I had standing. I had the right to demand a full formal accounting of the trust, in writing, that Robert would be legally obligated to provide. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something underneath my feet that wasn't grief or suspicion. It was the floor of the law, and it held my weight. Carter told me what I needed next. Discrepancies and suspicions weren't enough to walk into a room and win. I needed the money mapped, every transfer traced from my father's accounts to wherever it had finally come to rest, documented by someone whose word a court would respect. He gave me a name, a forensic accountant. Her name was Jennifer, and she worked the way I imagined surgeons work, calm and exact and a little frightening in her precision. I handed her the statements and the incorporation records, and 3 weeks later she handed me back a report that turned my pile of suspicious numbers into a story with a beginning, a middle, and a body. She had traced the full $600,000 out of my father's accounts and the business, into Robert's consulting company, and then back out again, this time into things you could touch. A lake property 2 states away, held under the company's name, a boat, renovations on his own house. The faucet I'd seen in the statements had a drain at the end of it, and the drain emptied directly into Robert's life, where I'd had a feeling I now had a map, itemized and dated, with my uncle's name at the end of every line. There was one piece left, the one Carter said could turn a strong civil case into something Robert could not laugh his way out of: the signature. I took both versions of the trust to a document examiner, a soft-spoken woman who treated my father's handwriting like evidence at a crime scene, because that's exactly what it was. She measured the pressure, the spacing, the angle of the letters, the way the pen lifted and landed, and then she signed her own name to a conclusion. The signature on the amended trust was not made by the same hand that signed the original. It was a forgery, combined with the timeline, with a company formed weeks after a death sentence and a signature that appeared on a document my father was too sick to have negotiated. I no longer had a theory. I had documentary proof, financial proof, and expert proof, 3 separate spines holding up one undeniable truth. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a strange, heavy calm, the way you feel when you finally understand something you wish weren't true. My uncle hadn't been careless or desperate. He had been patient and deliberate, and he had used the worst months of my father's life as cover. And then Robert moved, the way I'd known he eventually would. He called a family meeting. He framed it in a warm group message that made my aunt cry with gratitude, as a way to finally bring closure and honor James's memory by settling everything cleanly. But Carter read the message over my shoulder and went very still, because tucked inside the warmth was the real machinery. Robert wanted everyone to gather and sign waivers, documents releasing him from any liability as administrator, formally approving all his management of the trust and the business, closing the books forever. He was asking the family to legally forgive a theft they didn't know had happened, and to do it while thanking him for his service. It was, I had to admit, almost elegant. Once those waivers were signed, recovering the money would become enormously harder. The family would have endorsed him in writing. My evidence would slam into a wall of relatives who had voluntarily released their own thief. He wasn't covering his tracks anymore. He was getting us to pave over them ourselves, with smiles on our faces. I felt the window closing, and I felt the temptation to panic, to expose everything immediately in a frantic email to the whole family. But I'd learned that lesson in my car with the engine running. Moving too soon would scatter everything. I had to counter him without showing my hand, which meant I had to let him keep believing he'd already won. So I texted back a single word, "Wonderful." And I started to prepare. The phone calls from family stopped first. That's how I knew something had shifted before anyone said a word to my face. My cousin, who used to text me memes at midnight, went quiet. An aunt who always asked after my health started answering my messages a day late. In short, careful sentences. I've lived long enough to recognize the temperature of a room cooling around me, and the whole family had gone cold at the edges. It took me almost 2 weeks to understand why, and when I did, it landed harder than any of the bank statements had. Robert had gotten ahead of me. While I'd been quietly building my case, he'd been quietly building his, and his case was about me. The story he'd been telling, gently, sorrowfully, never cruelly, was that I wasn't well. That grief had hit me harder than the others, that I'd become obsessed with the money, fixated on the paperwork, that I'd been saying strange things about the family, and then the masterstroke, delivered with a sad shake of the head, that he worried I was after the inheritance for myself, that my interest in the accounts wasn't suspicion but greed. Everything I had actually been doing, the careful, honest work of uncovering a theft, he had taken and turned inside out, so that the very evidence of my diligence became proof of my instability. I wasn't an investigator anymore. I was a problem the family was worried about. And being disbelieved, I discovered, cuts deeper than being robbed. The money was just money. This was my own people looking at me with pity instead of trust. It came to a head at a family gathering I almost didn't attend. Robert chose his moment beautifully, the way he chose everything. We were all seated, plates full, and he set down his fork and looked at me across the table with an expression of pure, performed tenderness. "Sarah," he said, loud enough for everyone, "I've been so worried about you, sweetheart. You've taken all of this on yourself. The books, the paperwork, all of it." He turned to the table. "I think it's time we let her rest. She's done enough. She shouldn't be carrying the numbers anymore." And around the table I watched it happen, watched the soft, sympathetic nods, watched my relatives look at me with gentle concern, as though I were a woman who needed to be gently relieved of her car keys. He had publicly stripped me of the one role that gave me access, and he'd done it while wrapping me in so much love that to object would prove his point. I sat very still. I thanked him for his concern. I did not detonate. But God, it cost me. It cost me more than I can put into words, to be humiliated so kindly in front of everyone I had left. I drove home that night and, for the first time, I genuinely doubted myself, not the facts. The facts were in a safe deposit box and they didn't waver. What I doubted was the cost. I sat in my dark kitchen and asked myself if I was about to take a family that had just buried a man and break it the rest of the way. Maybe I should let it go. Maybe my father, who loved peace, would have wanted me to swallow it for the sake of the others. Maybe being right wasn't worth being the woman who tore everyone apart. It was Margaret who answered me, though I hadn't asked her out loud. I called her, half hoping she'd give me permission to quit, and instead my 81-year-old grandmother listened to my doubt, and then cut clean through it. "Protecting your father's wishes," she said, "is not betraying this family. Robert betrayed this family. You are the only one trying to put it right. Don't you dare let him make his crime into your guilt." And Carter, when I called him next, said something simpler, and just as steadying. "You're not breaking anything, Sarah. You're just turning on the light." Whatever the light shows was already there. I hung up the phone steadier than I'd been in weeks. The doubt didn't vanish, but it stopped running the show. I recommitted, quieter and harder than before. And then Robert, drunk on his own victory, handed me the last thing I needed. He came to find me after that dinner, days later, certain he'd won, certain I'd been put back in my place. He found me alone, and he couldn't resist. He never could. With that easy, confident smile, he as good as told me the truth. He said he'd only ever managed the money for the good of the family. That someone had to make the hard decisions James was too sick to make. And then, leaning in, almost amused, he said the thing that sealed him. "And honestly, Sarah, even if you think something's wrong, who do you imagine is going to believe you? Look at yourself." My phone was in my pocket. It had been recording from the moment I saw him walk toward me, because I had learned, finally, to expect the worst from the most charming man in the room. I let him finish. I let him say all of it. Then I thanked him for his honesty, in a voice so calm it surprised even me, and I walked to my car holding the last piece of the case he never knew he'd given me. I spent the next week doing the thing Robert had never once bothered to do. I organized. On my dining table, in a single black folder with labeled tabs, I built the whole story so that anyone, a relative, a lawyer, a stranger, a judge, could open and understand in 10 minutes what had taken me months to uncover. First tab, my father's original trust, naming me co-trustee in his own true hand. Second tab, Robert's forged version, with the altered page flagged. Third, the document examiner's signed conclusion that the signature was not my father's. Fourth, Jennifer's forensic accounting, the full 600,000 mapped from my father's accounts to the lake house and the boat. Fifth, the bank statements. Sixth, the incorporation records dated weeks after the diagnosis. And last, the recording. What struck me, as I assembled it, was how easy it had been once I started looking, and why. Robert had been careless in exactly the way powerful men are careless. He assumed no one was watching, because no one ever had. He'd grown up being the charming one, the one excused from the details, and so he'd never developed the instinct to cover his tracks, because he'd never needed one. He left a company registered under his own name. He left a forged signature anyone could compare. He left a trail of even, lazy numbers, confident that the only person careful enough to read them was the one person he'd already convinced everyone not to believe. His whole life had taught him that charm was enough. He had no idea that charm leaves no records, and that records were the one thing I had never stopped keeping. Then I built my coalition, quietly, one person at a time. Carter agreed to attend the family meeting as my counsel, not to make a scene, he said, but to make sure the conversation stayed on the documents. Margaret was harder to keep out of it than to bring in. When I told her what I'd found, her old eyes went flint, hard, and she said simply, "I was there when James wrote that trust. I'll say so to anyone's face." She would be my witness, the one person alive who remembered my father's true wishes and feared no one in that family. And Michael Brooks, the banker, provided certified copies of the statements, the kind that carried the bank's own seal, so no one could claim I doctored a spreadsheet at my kitchen table. One by one, the people Robert had dismissed or overlooked were quietly lining up behind me. The niece he'd written off had a lawyer, a witness, and a bank, and here was the part I had to sit with, because it went against every instinct I had. I could have struck first. I could have sent the whole folder to every relative the moment I had it, exposed him in a single devastating email. But I didn't. Instead, I let Robert keep planning his waiver meeting. I let him send his warm messages and book the room and feel his control tighten, because in his arrogance he was doing the one thing I could never have arranged on my own. He was gathering the entire family into a single room, on a single day, of his own free will. He thought he was building the stage for his coronation. He was building it for his exposure. There is a particular patience required to watch a confident man construct his own trap, and to do nothing but hand him the nails. I found that patience. I'd earned it. The night before the meeting, I didn't rehearse a speech. I'd seen too many people lose their footing by performing, and I had no intention of giving Robert a hysterical niece to point at. Instead, I sat at my table with the folder closed in front of me, and a photograph of my father beside it, the one where he's squinting into the sun on the dock he was so proud of, before any of this, before the diagnosis, before his own brother decided his dying was an opportunity. I looked at him for a long time. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the hot way I'd been in the car with the engine running months earlier. The anger had cooled into something more useful. What I felt, sitting there, was clarity. This was not revenge. I kept telling myself that, gently, like a vow. I was not doing this to destroy Robert, though it would destroy him, and I'd made my peace with that. I was doing it to put back what he'd taken, to restore what my father had actually wanted, and to stop being a woman who could be robbed and then made to apologize for noticing. I set my intention as plainly as I could. I would walk into that room calm. I would let the documents speak. I would not raise my voice once. Dignity, not a scene. Truth, not a tantrum. I closed my eyes and told my father, out loud in my empty kitchen, that I had every record, every single one. Then I turned off the light, and I went to sleep more soundly than I had since the funeral. Because for the first time in months, I knew exactly what tomorrow held. Robert did not. Robert had chosen my aunt's large dining room for the meeting, and he'd set it up like a man who'd done this before, chairs arranged, papers stacked neatly at one end of the long table, a pot of coffee already warm. He stood at the head of it as the family filed in, greeting each person with a hand on the shoulder, a soft word, that easy warmth that had carried him his whole life. When everyone was seated, he began, and I will admit, even knowing everything I knew, it was a beautiful performance. He thanked us all for coming. He spoke about James with real, sounding emotion, about how hard the year had been, about the weight of holding the family together through grief. He said it was time, finally, to bring everything to a close, to settle the trust and the business cleanly so the family could heal instead of drowning in paperwork. He gestured to the stack of waivers. Just a formality, he said, just everyone signing to approve how things had been managed and to release the burden from his shoulders so they could all move forward. And then, gently, sorrowfully, he glanced at me. I know this has been especially hard on Sarah, he said. She's carried so much. I hope today gives her some peace too. Around the table, the sympathetic nods began again. Pens were uncapped. My aunt reached for the first waiver. I let him finish. I let every last word of it land. Then I raised my hand, just slightly, and said, before anyone signs, may I say one thing? Robert smiled and spread his hands, magnanimous, certain. Of course, sweetheart. Of course. I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my bag and laid a single document on the table and slid it toward the center where everyone could see. This is Dad's trust, I said quietly. The original. The one he signed and kept in his desk. I let them look. Then I laid the second one beside it. And this is the version Robert gave all of you. I pointed to one page, calmly, like a teacher. In Dad's version, he named two people to manage his estate. Robert. And me. In Robert's version, that page has been changed. My name is gone. And the signature at the bottom isn't Dad's. For a moment Robert laughed, that warm, dismissive laugh I'd heard 100 times. Sarah, honey, this is exactly what I've been worried about. You can't just… Mr. Carter, I said. Would you introduce yourself? And William Carter, who had been sitting quietly at the far end looking like just another relative, set down his coffee and said, I'm Sarah's attorney. I specialize in trusts and estates. I'd suggest everyone hold off on signing anything until you've heard the rest. The room changed temperature in a single breath. Robert's laugh died in his throat. My aunt put her pen down. I kept going, calm as still water. I laid out the forensic report next, and I walked them through it in plain language, no legal terms, just the path of the money. Starting a few weeks after Dad's diagnosis, I said, money began leaving his accounts and the business. $600,000 over many months. Small enough amounts that no one would notice. It all went to a consulting company. I set down the incorporation records. This company was created weeks after we learned Dad was dying. It has one owner. I looked up, and I held my uncle's eyes for the first time all day. Robert. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. These were people who, 2 weeks ago, had thanked him for buying their dinners and slipping their children cash. And I watched the math happen on their faces, slow and sick. The generous money, the gifts, the warmth, all of it had been theirs. He hadn't been the family's benefactor. He'd been spending the family's stolen money and collecting their gratitude as interest. Robert's face had gone from amused to gray. This is insane, he said, and the warmth was gone now, the charm cracking down the middle. She's twisted everything. You all know how she's been. None of this means what she's. There's one more thing, I said. I took out my phone. My hand did not shake, which surprised me. After the last dinner, Robert came to talk to me. I'd like everyone to hear it. And I pressed play. His own voice filled my aunt's dining room, unmistakable, confident, contemptuous. As someone had to make the hard decisions James was too sick to make. And then, worse, the line that finished him in front of every person he'd ever charmed. Even if you think something's wrong, Sarah, who do you imagine is going to believe you? Look at yourself. The recording stopped. No one moved. Robert's mouth opened and closed, and for the first time in my life I watched my uncle find nothing there, no smile, no story, no escape. It was Margaret who spoke into that silence, my 81-year-old grandmother, sitting straight, backed at the table. I was in the room when James wrote that trust. She said, her voice clear and final. He named Sarah. He told me to my face he'd never trust Robert with $1. She looked down the table at her younger son, and her eyes were dry and terrible, and it seems he was right. The whole room turned. I could feel it move, like a tide changing direction, away from the charming man at the head of the table and toward the quiet woman who'd brought every record. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't needed to. For a few seconds after Margaret spoke, nobody knew what to do with their hands. And then the room broke, not into chaos, but into something quieter and far more dangerous for Robert, a slow, collective turning. My aunt picked up the stack of waivers she'd been about to sign, looked at them as though they were something that might bite, and tore them down the middle. My cousin, the one who'd gone cold on me for weeks, turned to Robert and asked the question I think they were all asking inside. The money you gave my kids. The dinners. That was Dad's money. That was all of ours. Robert started to answer, reached for the old warmth, the easy charm, and found that it no longer worked on a single person in that room. They had heard his voice on the recording. They had seen the two documents side by side. The spell that had carried him his whole life simply stopped functioning, all at once, like a light going out. The man who'd walked in as the patriarch was, within 10 minutes, just a man at the head of a table that no longer believed him. It was Carter who brought order to it, calmly, the way he did everything. He explained, to the whole family, what happened next, and he was careful to keep it factual, never gloating. As a legally established co-trustee, I would be petitioning to have Robert removed as administrator immediately, which the forged document alone made nearly certain. There would be a civil action to recover the $600,000 and the assets it had been turned into. And the forgery and the fraud, he said evenly, were not just civil matters. They were crimes, and the evidence, the examiner's report, the recording, the paper trail, would be referred to the proper authorities. Robert tried, one last time, to bluster, to say I'd manipulated everything, that he'd get his own lawyer, that we'd all regret this. But the threat landed in a dead room. His own lawyer, when he eventually got one, would be looking at the same documents we were. There was no version of the story left that he could tell, because his own voice had already told the true one. What came next took months, not minutes, and I won't pretend it was clean or fast. But it was sure. Through the court, Carter moved quickly to freeze the assets held by Robert's consulting company before he could quietly sell or hide them. And because we'd come prepared with everything documented and certified, the judge granted it. The lake property he'd been so proud of, the one bought with my father's dying money, was placed under the court's control. The boat, the renovations couldn't be undone, but their value could be counted against what he owed. One by one, the things Robert had turned my father's life into were turned back, liquidated, the proceeds directed where they should have gone all along into the trust. To be distributed the way James had actually written it. The $600,000 didn't return in a single dramatic check. It came back the way it had left, in pieces, over time. But it came back. The faucet I'd watched drain my father's life's work was finally running the other direction. And Robert grew smaller through all of it. That's the part I think about most. The charges came, the formal ones, and with them the thing his charm had never had to survive before consequences that didn't care how likable he was. The family that had adored him stopped taking his calls. My aunt, who'd nearly signed away the whole thing in his honor, wouldn't be in a room with him. The cousins he'd handed cash to looked at him now and saw where it had come from. He'd spent his entire life being the one everyone forgave, the one excused from the bill, and now there was a bill that no smile could wave away. The last time I saw him in person, at a court date, he looked like a deflated version of the man who'd given that flawless eulogy. Diminished, ordinary. A man who'd finally met a record he couldn't charm. People assume I must have felt triumphant in those months, that I must have savored watching him fall. I didn't. I keep waiting, even now, to feel the satisfaction I thought I'd feel, and it never quite arrives, because there's nothing to celebrate in your own family being what Robert turned out to be. What I felt instead was something quieter and, I think, more honest. I felt the relief of a boundary finally being enforced. For years, decades really, this family had run on the unspoken rule that Robert got to do as he pleased and the rest of us made it work, smoothed it over, looked away. He had simply assumed that rule would protect him through this too, that family would once again mean immunity. The deepest thing I did wasn't expose a theft. It was end that rule. I said with documents instead of anger, that being family did not mean being allowed to rob us and be thanked for it. My father had named me co-trustee for a reason. I think, somewhere in those last months, sick as he was, he knew. He knew which of his children was the charming one and which one kept the records. And he knew, when it came to it, who would actually protect what he'd built. He'd been right his whole life about people. He was right about me too. The apologies came slowly, the way these things do, in ones and twos, usually over coffee or in the doorway after some smaller family gathering where Robert's absence sat in the room like a piece of furniture nobody mentioned. My aunt was first. She came to my house, sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once laid two versions of a trust side by side at 2 in the morning. And she cried, and she said she was sorry, that she'd believed him, that she'd looked at me with pity when I'd been telling the truth the whole time. I let her say it. I didn't rush to make her feel better, because some apologies need to be fully felt by the person giving them, not waved away to ease the discomfort. But when she was done, I told her I understood, because I did. Robert had fooled all of us for years. There's no shame in being lied to by someone whose entire life was a lie. The shame, if there was any, was his. Not every bond healed, and I made my peace with that too. Some relatives apologized and meant it, and we found our way back. Others apologized because the facts left them no choice, and with those, I was polite and warm and kept a careful, permanent distance, because I'd learned something about myself in all of this. I no longer mistook the absence of conflict for the presence of trust. My cousin and I are close again, closer than before, honestly, because we went through something true together. A few others I see at holidays and nothing more. I forgave where forgiveness was earned, and I declined, gently, to perform it where it wasn't. That, I think, is its own kind of dignity. Grace is not the same as amnesia. With the trust finally restored and back under proper administration, I did the thing I'd been fighting for all along, the thing that was never really about the $600,000 at all. I carried out my father's actual wishes, the ones in his real handwriting. There was money he'd set aside for Margaret, to make sure his mother never wanted for anything in her last years, and I made certain she got every cent of it, and then some. There was the business he'd spent 30 careful years building, and instead of letting it be drained into a stranger's boat, I stabilized it, protected it, kept it doing what he'd built it to do. The things he'd intended for the family, the small bequests, the support he'd quietly planned for the people he loved, I delivered them exactly as he'd written them, not as Robert had rewritten them. For the first time, James's legacy looked like James, and not like the man who tried to erase him one forged page at a time. I think about who I was before all this, and who I became more often than I expected to. Before, I was the careful one, the detail person, the woman people handed the boring paperwork to because she wouldn't complain and wouldn't miss a comma. It was, I always understood, a slightly dismissive compliment, the kind you give someone you find useful, rather than impressive. Robert had counted on exactly that. He'd looked at me and seen the family bookkeeper, the anxious niece, someone who could be managed and discredited and waved aside. He never once imagined that the very thing he dismissed me for, the careful, unglamorous, relentless keeping of records, was the one thing in the world that could end him. The trait I'd been faintly mocked for my whole life turned out to be the trait that protected my father's name. I don't think of myself as the careful one anymore, like it's something small. I think of it as my spine. These days the folder lives in the safe deposit box, and I rarely take it out. But I went, not long ago, to close out some final piece of the estate, and the box was open in front of me, and there it was, the original trust in my father's true hand, the forged page, the report, the records, all of it. The weapons of a quiet war that's over now. I sat with it for a moment in that little bank room, and then I closed the folder and slid the box shut, and I felt the strangest, cleanest peace settle over me. The chaos of those months, the cold family, the public humiliation, the doubt in my dark kitchen, all of it had passed through and left this behind. A quiet life, a restored legacy, a family with the rot finally cut out of it. Robert never imagined those records existed. That's the whole thing, really, the entire story in one line. He performed his grief and forged his page and charmed his room, and the entire time, sitting in a folder he didn't know about, in a box he couldn't reach, was every receipt of what he'd done. He underestimated the quiet woman keeping track. People like him always do. And my father, who'd spent a lifetime being quietly right about everyone, got the one thing the dying so rarely get. He got the truth told on his behalf, and his wishes honored, by the daughter he trusted enough to name. If there's one thing I want you to take from all of this, it's something I learned the hard way, in a dark kitchen, doubting myself while a charming man told everyone I was the problem. Charm is not character. The most beloved person in the room is not automatically the most honest one, and sometimes the warmth that wins everyone over is exactly the thing being used to rob them. Family is not immunity. Loving someone does not mean handing them your trust without a single record to back it up. And the quietest habit I had, keeping track, writing things down, saving the receipt, nobody thought mattered, turned out to be the thing that protected the people I loved most. I stayed calm. I stayed prepared. And in the end, the steadiest hand beat the loudest, most beloved liar in the room. Not with rage, with proof. So let me ask you, before we go, have you ever been the quiet one in your family, the one who was underestimated, dismissed, or disbelieved by the people who should have known you best? I'd love to hear your story, so tell me about it in the comments below. And if this one stayed with you, follow along because there are more stories like it coming. Until then, take care of your peace and keep your paperwork.